지금 이제 다시 워크숍 시작할게요. 생중계에 틀어주세요. So the next lecture is by Dr. Wee-ho Ha of KIRAMS.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Wee-ho Ha, working at KIRAMS. In this talk, I will talk about ICRP biokinetic and dosimetric model. And I'm not sure how much of you are familiar with ICRP biokinetic and dosimetric model. ICRP stands for International Commission of the Radiological Protections, and they issued a lot of publications regarding the radiation protection and radiation dosimetry. Especially among these various publications, I just summarized the biokinetic and dosimetric model published in ICRP. I think such kind of biokinetic and dosimetric model is very important to provide the medical treatment of the internally contaminated patients in case of radiation emergency. But you have to note that this model is the reference model, not individualized model. So in case of the high exposed patients, you need to be more consideration about to choose the proper biokinetic model to provide the best possible medical treatment to them. So I just want to introduce the standard reference biokinetic and dosimetric model provided from the ICRP. And I will cover the introduction of this model and internal dosimetry, and then I will talk about biokinetic model and dosimetric model. And lastly, I will briefly introduce the internal dosimetry using these biokinetic and dosimetric model provided from ICRP. And you have to know these concepts of the internal contamination. First step is the intake of the radionuclide into the body. So intake means the amount of the radioactivity which entered into the body. So this is the first step. You have to know the intake. Intake means the amount of the radioactivity entering into the body. And then these radionuclides will move from the organ, internal organ to the other organs by the transfer of the radionuclides. And then lastly, these radionuclides will be excreted to the excreta sample like urine or feces. So this is the third step of the movement of the radionuclides in the human body. And additionally, you have to know the half-life of the radionuclides. There are two half-life, physical and biological half-lives. Physical half-life is the time required for some radionuclide to reduce the original activity into a half of the original activity due to some nuclear decay or nuclear transformation. This is the physical half-life. So this physical half-life is determined by the type of the radionuclides. Depending on the kinds of radionuclide, this specific value is determined. So for example, in case of cesium-137, its physical half-life is 30 years. And in case of iodine-131, it's very short. It has very short physical half-life, just 8 days. So this physical half-life is determined the type of the radionuclides. And the biological half-life, this half-life work in case of internal contamination, only in case of internal contamination, not in case of the external exposure. it's not related to external exposure. In case of only internal exposure, biological half-life will work in the human body. So biological half-life means the time required for some specific radionuclides, same as to reduce into half of original activity due to biological process of the radionuclides in the body, like metabolic process in the body. So this biological half-life is totally different with physical half-life. In case of the cesium-137, its biological half-life is about 80 days, even though its physical half-life is 30 years. So in case of internal contamination of cesium-137, about 80 days after the intake event, the original activity will decrease into a half of its original activity because its biological half-life is 80 days, even though its physical half-life is 30 years. And in case of the iodine-131's physical half-life is 8 days, but its biological half-life is more than 100 days. So in this case of the internal contamination of iodine-131, the effective half-life, we called effective half-life considering both biological and physical half-life. So the effective half-life is about less than 8 days because its physical half-life is shorter than biological half-life in case of iodine-131. So in case of internal contamination, you have to know about these two half-lives, physical and biological half-lives. And in addition, we have to consider the commitment period. In case of internal exposure, these radionuclides, some specific radionuclides can enter into the body. So after intake of radionuclides, these radionuclides will be remained in the body during some specific period of time, depending on the effective half-life. So to calculate the internal dose, we just consider the dose commitment period called tau. So according to this value, tau, the estimated internal dose is different. If we apply the longer commitment period, the estimated dose will be higher. And if we apply shorter commitment period, the estimated dose will decrease. And this is the concept of the effective half-life again. As I mentioned before, in case of the effective half-life, we have to consider both physical and biological half-life in case of internal exposure. This x-axis means the time after intake, and y-axis means the dose rate in the body. After intake of radionuclides, the dose rate in the body will occur like this. So after time passed, this dose rate in the body will decrease according to the effective half-life. If some specific radionuclides has a very short half-life, the dose rate in the body will sharply decrease according to the time passed. But in case of the radionuclide having long effective half-life, the dose rate in the body will slowly decrease like this. So depending on the effective half-life, considering both physical and biological half-life, the decreasing speed of the dose rate is different. So you need to consider about this concept to estimate internal dose. And for internal dose assessment, we just use the committed dose as a dose quantity in case of internal exposure. So committed dose is estimated as the time integration of the dose rate in the organs or tissues of the body. So in this graph, the dose rate in the body will decrease as the time goes up, depending on the effective half-life. In this case, committed dose means the integration of the dose rate in the specific period of time during commitment period. So this area, integrated area, is means the internal dose, committed dose. So this committed dose will be determined by the commitment period and effective half-life, because effective half-life affect the decreasing slope of the dose rate in the body. And the initial amount of the intake is also affect to the internal dose, like committed dose. This is the concept of the committed dose and dose commitment period. So you have to consider about the dose commitment period and the effective half-life in case of internal exposure. And we use committed dose as a dose quantity in case of internal exposure. So there are two dose quantities: effective committed equivalent dose H tau and committed effective dose E tau. So tau means the dose commitment period. And in case of the general population, members of the public, we just applied the period to be age 70 years old for general population. And in case of the radiation workers in workplaces, we applied the commitment period of 50 years for the conservative estimation of the internal dose. And let's think about the ages to be age 70 years old. In case of 10 years old boy, the commitment period will be 60 years old, 60 years. And in case of the 15 years old children, the commitment period will be 55 years. So in case of the general population, members of the public, the commitment period is different according to their age. And we need to distinguish the source organ and target organ, source region and target regions. Source region, in case of internal contamination, we have to distinguish these two regions. Source region is organs or tissues containing the radionuclides after the intake of radionuclides. And the target regions is organs or tissues to which the energy from the radionuclides in the source region is absorbed. So in case, let's look at this picture. In this case, the source region is the lung, because radionuclides are distributed in the lung like this. In this case, the source region is just the lung, but target region will be lung as well. And additionally, the other organ and tissues like liver, stomach, and the intestine will be also target region from the radiation energy emitted from the source region. So we have to distinguish these regions, source regions and target region, to calculate the internal dose and to describe the biokinetic model. And committed dose, like committed equivalent dose and committed effective dose, can be estimated using the biokinetic and dosimetric model, which including the source region and target region. And this is the concept of the internal dose assessment provided from the ICRP 130 regarding the occupational intake of radionuclide OIR report. In this report, they provide the concept of the internal flow of the internal dosimetry like this. First step is quantification of the intake value by the inhalation or ingestion. So first step is quantification of the intake value. And then using biokinetic and dosimetric model, we can calculate the mean observed dose, DTR, in a specific organ or tissues. And then applying the radiation weighting factor, we can estimate the equivalent dose in a specific organ and tissues. And lastly, applying tissue weighting factor, we can calculate the effective dose. But as you can see, this process is a little complicated to apply this method. So in practice, we cannot directly calculate using this process. We just apply the dose coefficient to convert the intake into the internal dose as a committed effective dose or a committed equivalent dose using this simple formula. Committed effective dose is a product of intake and dose coefficient, small e tau. Small e tau means dose coefficient. So simply, we can estimate internal dose like a committed effective dose or a committed equivalent dose by using this simple formula, using the intake and dose coefficient. It's very simple. And this is a radiation weighting factor provided from the ICRP. And this is the tissue weighting factors. And using these radiation weighting factor and tissue weighting factors, we can lastly calculate and estimate the committed effective dose. This is the formula of the effective dose provided from the ICRP 103. ICRP 103 is a new recommendation. So in this recommendation, they recommend to use sex averaged equivalent dose to estimate the effective dose. And you have to note that this effective dose can never be measured. So by some calculation or a simulation, we can obtain this effective dose. And this is the process of the internal dosimetry in practice. First step is the quantification of the intake. To quantify this intake value, we applied two methods, direct measurement or indirect measurement. Direct measurements, also known as the in vivo bioassay, including the whole body counter or lung counting, thyroid monitoring, and so on. And indirect measurements is also known as in vitro bioassay, like urine bioassay or feces bioassay. And through these bioassay measurement, we can get bioassay measured quantity, measurement quantity, like large M. And we have to use the bioassay function like body retention excretion, body retention fraction or body, excretion fraction in urine or feces. This called bioassay functions. By using this measured quantity and bioassay function, we can determine the intake value using this formula. And then by applying the dose coefficients, considering the type of the radionuclides and the other factors like compound form and the absorption type and the size of the particle, we have to choose the proper dose coefficients And then we can finally get to committed effective dose like this. This is the whole process of the internal dose assessment in practice. And biokinetic model was developed to describe the intake and uptake, distribution, retention, and the subsequent excretion by various pathways. This is the biokinetic model developed in ICRP. And bioassay function like body retention fraction or excretion fraction and the number of the transformation in the source region are determined by this biokinetic model. And dosimetric model was developed to estimate the energy depositions to the target regions per nuclear transformation in the source region. So to calculate the energy deposition in the target region from the radionuclides in the source region, we have to use this dosimetric model. And next, I want to introduce biokinetic model provided from the ICRP. ICRP used compartment model to describe deposition and whole movement of the radionuclide through the body. And all tissues and organs are defined as the compartment, even though blood is also defined as one of the compartment. So after the intake of radionuclides, the transfer of the radionuclides, which is describing using the compartment model, they describe the behavior of the radionuclides. And lastly, by the transfer of the radionuclides, these radionuclides will be removed from the excretion process. This is the whole route of the intake and transfer and excretion. The routes of the intake are including the inhalation of the air, including the radionuclides. This is the one of the main routes of the intake. And the other routes of intake is ingestion of the foodstuff or drinking water, including the radionuclides after some unintended accidents. And the other routes of intake are wound contamination or skin absorption, like this. In this case, these radionuclides can be moved to the subcutaneous tissue or blood directly. These are general routes of the intake of the radionuclides. And transfer can occur through the blood compartment. So as I mentioned before, blood is one of the compartments. So by using this compartment, the movement of the radionuclides from blood was described. And let's look at the excretion route. Excretion routes are including the urine to urine or feces, and the others sweating, and exhalation is also the route of the excretion. But the rate of the sweating or exhalation is smaller compared to the amount of the urine or feces. So in practice, we just use the urine samples or feces samples for in vitro bioassay. And this part is the human respiratory tract model to describe the inhalation process of the radionuclides. And this part is the human alimentary tract model to describe the digestion of the radionuclides after ingestion of the radionuclides. And this part is the systemic model depending on the elements. This is developed to describe the circulation of the blood from the human respiratory tract or human alimentary tract into the blood. And last one is UND model. UND model was developed in the NCRP, not ICRP. ICRP didn't develop the UND model, so they just adopted the NCRP's UND model. NCRP stands for U.S. National Council on Radiological Protection and Management. They are similar with the ICRP. They are just the U.S. protection body. Anyway, they developed the UND model. So ICRP adopted the UND model developed in the NCRP. And this one is a human respiratory tract model. This model was provided from the ICRP publication 66 in 1994. And there are two parts in the respiratory tract. First part is extrathoracic, and second one is thoracic region. Extrathoracic region is including the ET1 and ET2. ET1 is posterior nasal passages, and ET2 is anterior nasal passages and the pharynx and larynx. They are included in ET2 region. And thoracic region, there are large BB, bronchi, and small BB, which means bronchial, and AI region means alveolar interstitial. So thoracic regions composed of three parts: large BB, small BB, and AI region. And this model is the compartment model of the human respiratory tract model. We call this one as original HLTM model. But in ICRP publication 130, they revised the original HLTM like this. So they the compartments a little bit changed, and esophagus added instead of the GI tract in the previous model. And in the human respiratory tract model, to describe the inhalation of the radionuclides, we have to consider about the particle size and the absorption type of the radionuclides. So particle size in ICRP, we just use the AMAD, stands for the activity median aerodynamic diameter, which means the diameter of the aerosol, including some radionuclide, which have the medium activity. So, as a default value of the radiation workers, they applied the AMAD of 5 micrometer, and for the members of the public, they applied the AMAD of the 1 micrometer as a default value. So you have to choose the proper AMAD value as the particle size in case of the inhalation of the radionuclides. And absorption type have 4 different types: very fast, moderate, and slow. And very fast means 100% of the radionuclides will transfer into the blood from the respiratory tract model instantaneously. So this type can be applied for the gaseous or vapor type material. And in case of the past type, 100% of the radionuclides will transfer into the blood with a half-time of the 30 minutes. So this type can be applied for the soluble type material. And moderate type means that 20% of the radionuclides will be transferred into the blood with a 6-hour half-time. And the other 80% of the radionuclides will be transferred into the blood from the respiratory tract with a 140 days half-time. So moderate type can be applied for the material with medium solubility. And last one is a slow. Slow type means the 100% of the material will be transferred into the blood with a 6-hour half-time, and the others transferred into the blood with a 7,000 days half-time. So slow type can be applied for the insoluble type material. So by considering the type of the compounds of the involved radionuclides, we have to choose the proper absorption type. But if you don't have any information about this one, ICRP just recommend the default biokinetic parameter in the HLTM. So you'd better just use the default value if you don't have any information about this one. But if you have this information, considering the site or the affected area, you'd better use the site-specific information to estimate the internal dose more accurately. Anyway, ICRP provided the default absorption type and default AMAD value for the assessment of the internal dose. And this table shows you the regional deposition of the inhaled aerosol with 5 micrometer AMAD in the reference worker. So most of the radionuclide will be deposited in the extrathoracic region, ET1 and ET2, by applying the 5 micrometer AMAD. Sorry. This graph shows you the regional deposition of the radionuclides depending on the AMAD value. In this graph, the greater AMAD, the more deposition occurred in the extrathoracic region like this, ET1 and ET2. On the other hand, if the AMAD is go up, the deposition rate in the AI region will decrease like this. So depending on the particle size, the size of the AMAD, the deposition rate in each region of the HLTM is totally different. So this can cause the different internal dose value. So you have to use proper AMAD value to determine the accurate internal dose. And this is the clearance model of the radionuclides from the respiratory tract. From the ET region, the radionuclides will be removed to the lymph node or blood directly. So to describe the clearance of the radionuclides in the respiratory tract model, ICRP recommend to use this model. And next one is a human elementary tract model to describe the ingestion of the radionuclides. In ICRP 30, they developed the GI tract model. This is very simple model to describe the behavior of the radionuclides after ingestion of the radionuclides. Simply, they adopted this compartment model to represent the human GI tract in 1979. But recently, not recently, in 2006, they developed the new human elementary tract model. So they added more compartment to describe the behavior of the radionuclide after ingestion of the radionuclide in more detail. They added oral cavity and teeth and oral mucosa and esophagus. And they divided the stomach and other intestine, colon into wall part and contents part to describe the behavior of the radionuclides in more detail. This is the recent model of the human elementary tract model provided from the ICRP. And this is the UND model developed in the NCRP in the United States. As I mentioned before, ICRP just adopted this model because they didn't develop their own UND model. So this UND model was developed to describe the movement of the radionuclides after accidental injection through UND contamination or skin contamination. And next one is a systemic model to describe the blood circulation after the deposition in the blood of the radionuclides from the respiratory tract or alimentary tract. So this systemic circulation model is different according to the type of the element. So depending on the elements, you have to use the proper circulation model. This is the systemic model of the cobalt isotope. So all cobalts can be used using this systemic model. And next one is a bone systemic model of the bone seekers radionuclides like thorium isotope, neptunium, plutonium, americium, and curium. So these radionuclides have some characteristics to be deposited in the bone marrow. So in this circulation systemic model, they added the cortical marrow and trabecular marrow to describe the deposition of the radionuclides in the bone marrow. And this is the systemic model of the radioiodine isotopes. This one is a previous model developed in ICRP publication 30. And recently in OIR report, they provided a new systemic model of the radioiodine. And this one is systemic model of the cesium. We already know that cesium have characteristics to be deposited in the body muscle. So as you can see, the skeletal muscle, cesium contents is the highest in the skeletal muscle. So, due to this reason, we can use the whole body counter to measure the cesium isotope because we assume that it's homogeneously distributed in the body. And next one, I want to introduce the dosimetric model to calculate the energy deposition in the target region from the nuclear transformation of the source region. This is the equation of the effective dose. It's a little bit complicated, but it's an equation of the effective dose using the sex average equivalent dose for male and female. As same with this equation, this equation is the committed effective dose coefficients equation. This one. This formula is almost same with the equation of the effective dose. So to derive the committed effective dose coefficients, we have to use the sex averaged equivalent dose coefficients per male and female, like this. Tm tau means the committed equivalent dose coefficients per male, and HTF tau means the committed equivalent dose coefficients per female. So we have to apply sex averaged committed equivalent dose coefficients to derive the effective dose coefficients. So to calculate the committed dose coefficients, we have to use two terms, A tilde and S value. A tilde means number of the nuclear transformation per activity intake the source region. So the unit of this one, A tilde is the transformation number per Becquerel intake. It's the unit of this quantity. And S value was formerly called specific effective energy, which means the delivered energy in the target region from the radionuclide or radiation from the source region. So this means the equivalent dose from the nuclear transformation in the target region from the source region. So this S value can be calculated using this formula. We have to consider the radiation weighting factor and the energy of the radiation and the emission probability. And this term is the specific observed fraction. Specific observed fraction means the energy observed fraction in the target region from the emitted radiation in the source region. So anyway, the S values unit is the sievert per the transformation number. So as I mentioned before, the committed equivalent dose coefficients unit is the sievert per Becquerel intake, which is the product of the A tilde and the S value. So by multiplying this unit and by this unit, the final unit of those conversion coefficients is the sievert per Becquerel intake. So if you know information about the intake value, you can convert the internal dose by using this dose coefficient. I know it's a little complicated, but it's recommended from the ICRP. But happily, we can just apply the proper dose coefficients considering the type of the radionuclides and the other biokinetic parameters. And this is the dosimetric model to calculate the S value in the previous slide. To calculate the S value, we have to use this computation of human phantoms and nuclear decay data. And computation human phantom, now the reference computation of human phantom is the voxel-based phantom in the ICRP publication 110. And the nuclear decay data provided from the ICRP 107. By using these data, we can calculate the S value to determine the dose coefficient. And this is the SAF values provided from the ICRP 133. And they also use the ICRP voxel-based reference phantoms and nuclear decay data and Monte Carlo code to calculate the SAF. This is the specific observed fractions of the photon when the stomach wall is the target region and the source region is the liver. And this is the same. The source region is liver, and the target region is stomach wall. In this case, the specific observed fraction of the electron is like this graph. So anyway, ICRP provide the SAF values of the whole the radionuclides of the interest. These are those coefficients provided from the ICRP to be applied for the members of the public. As I mentioned before, those coefficients is different by the type of the radionuclides and the age of the involved and the absorption type like this. So you have to choose the proper those coefficients considering the other factors. And this is those coefficients for radiation workers provided from the new report of the OIL, operational intake of radionuclides, in the ICRP publication 137, published in 2017, last year. And this is my last part. I want to introduce internal dosimetry again by using these dosimetric and biokinetic model. I want to show you this slide again because this concept is very important to estimate the internal dose. There are several steps to estimate the effective dose, like committed effective dose as an internal exposure assessment. But you cannot use this complicated process at all. You just use this simple formula using the intake quantities and dose coefficients to calculate the internal dose. And this is the process. I want to show you again this biosafe functions was determined by using the biokinetic model, because biokinetic model is describing the behavior of the radionuclides in the source regions. So we can know the retained fraction of the radionuclides or excreted fraction in the excreta sample from the ICRP. So we have to use the proper biosafe function to determine the intake value. And those coefficients are also determined by using these biokinetic and dosimetric model. So ICRP already provided those coefficients data set considering this biokinetic and dosimetric model. So you have to choose the proper dose coefficient. And the determination of intake is also important to determine the internal dose. Intake can be determined by the direct or indirect measurement method. And we also need to consider the biosafe functions, small mt, as a function of time after intake. So by using these two quantities, we can get the intake information. And this is the biosafe function provided from the ICRP as well. And we can adopt two different functions, retention function or excretion function. And the unit is different according to the applied function. So you have to be careful to choose the biosafe function because the unit is different. So if you apply the direct measurement method, you have to use the retention function. And if you use the indirect measurement method, like urine bioassay, you have to apply the excretion function to determine the intake value. And these graphs show you the bioassay functions of the cobalt 60 and cesium 137 provided from the ICRP 78. And there are a lot of the ICRP publications about internal dose assessment for general population and radiation workers. So I just summarized the list of these documents. So these ICRP publications were published for internal dose assessment of the radiation workers from publication 30 to publication 137. And they will, ICRP will publish the OIR Part 4 and 5 maybe next year or later. Anyway, they published OIR Part 3 so far. And you can refer to these publications to estimate the internal dose of the radiation workers. And these publications are related to the internal dose assessment for members of the public from ICRP publication 56 to 95. And ICRP have a plan to publish the EIR report, environmental intake of the radionuclides, to be applied for the general population. So you can use this recent paper reports in the future. And lastly, I want to summarize my talk here. In general, internal dose assessment is very complicated compared to the internal dose assessment, external dose assessment. So you need to be special consideration to choose proper dose coefficients to determine the proper internal dose. And we cannot directly measure the committed effective dose from the measured quantity. And biokinetic and dosimetric model of the internal dosimetry have been provided from the various ICRP publications. So you can refer to these publications about the internal dosimetry. And lastly, I think understanding of this biokinetic and dosimetric model is very important to provide the medical treatment of the internally exposed patient in case of radiation emergency. So I hope this talk will help for you. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Okay, does anybody have any question or comments to my talk? Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm Songwon Seo. I'm sorry that I changed my presentation last minute, so there is a little different from the handouts. So today I'm going to talk about health effects associated with the radiation exposure. So as the previous talk reviews the details about biological effect of radiation, so we're going to briefly go over them, and then we're going to review epidemiological findings, some various studies. And if I have some time, I'm going to introduce our ongoing studies for Korean radiation workers. So there are some different criteria for classification of biological effect. In terms of time of onset, radiation in this disease can occur like a few weeks or months after exposure, which is acute effect, or it occurred or 5 years or 10 years later after exposure, it occurred like a late effect. And depending on the existence of a threshold, we can classify the deterministic effect, in other words, like a tissue reaction effect or a stochastic effect. The health effect that we mainly mentioned in this talk is like related to the late health effect and stochastic effect. So here is a brief summary of two effects. For deterministic effect, it's mainly due to the cell killing and have a dose threshold, typically high dose, like a several gray. And for stochastic effect, this is mainly due to cell changes and proliferation toward the malignant disease. And no dose threshold and probability of effect increases dose. So the typical disease is cancer. So IARC evaluate some cancers associated with the radiation. So they evaluate like 13 type of cancer with sufficient evidence, like stomach, colon, and lung, bone, something like that. And also they evaluate 7 types of cancer with positive association. But basically, it is very difficult to verify which cancer is not associated with the radiation. So basically, we consider all type of cancers for radiation epidemiology study. So now let's look at the review of epidemiological findings. So we're gonna briefly go over like ABAM survivor and nuclear accidents and radiation worker studies. So first is ABAM survivors. ABAM survivor data is very, very important and reference data. So most risk modeling for radiation field is based on that kind of data. So this is y-axis is like a cancer instance mortality, and axis is the years after exposure. So as you can see, the leukemia began to increase a few years after exposure, and 4 or 5 years later, it shows decrease. In the other end, the solid cancer cases, it began to increase over like 5 years or 10 years later. So there are two measurements for cancer risk or other health effects in this typical radiation epidemiology. So one is ERR, the other one is EAR. ERR is defined a proportional increase in risk over the background absolute risk. So it's kind of a relative risk. And EAR, which is excess absolute risk, defined as additional risk above the background absolute risk. So as you can see, both two risk measurement, the age at exposure is younger, the risk is higher than the older age group. So there is a high sensitivity in young ages. This is it's kind of a summary for those responsible for cancer risk based on ABAM survivors. Although there is still uncertainty in low dose ranges below 100 millisivert, there is a linear trend for solid cancer. For leukemia, is the best fit is known for like a linear quadratic models. Anyway, but linear model is provide the best fit over the full ranges. Other than cancer, there are also some other disease were observed. The first is cataracta. Cataracta, it occurred like 2 or 3 years after exposure. And in the past, the cataracta is usually considered as a deterministic effect, which means that there might have some threshold somewhere between 0 to 0.8 gray. But recently, there are emerging data supporting that the cataracta might be considered a stochastic effect. And for in neutral exposure, there is also increase of a severe mental retardation increased with the radiation dose. Typically, it's graded for the dose exposed 8 to 15 weeks of gestation. And prior 8 weeks or after 25 weeks, there was no detectable mental retardation observed. Another one is circulatory disease. As you can see, there is a kind of a trend over there as dose increases and also the circulatory disease also increases. So those about 0.5 gray was associated with the increased risk of both stroke and heart disease. But still, there is uncertainty in low dose ranges. So now let's look at some health consequences of a nuclear accident. So we're gonna briefly go over the Chernobyl case and Fukushima cases. It's the effective dose in Chernobyl. So this is a mean effective dose. The unit is millisievert. So the effective dose varies depending on the population. For the cleanup workers is about 100 millisievert, but resident is like 2 to like a 50 millisievert. But the tidal dose in Chernobyl is quite large, especially for young children. Their tidal dose is over 1 gray or 33 gray. But the Fukushima cases, the effective dose and observed tidal dose, they are kind of small compared to the Chernobyl cases. So let's look at the comparison of thyroid doses for children. So Chernobyl is mean tidal dose is about 500 millisievert, and Fukushima is most children is exposed to less than 1 millisievert. So there are some similarity and differences in between those accidents, but the main difference in terms of health consequences is the internal exposure in Chernobyl due to the delayed restriction on food product. So due to this internal exposure, there was an increase of childhood thyroid cancer. So this is the most obvious health effect in Chernobyl cases. So their relative risk is quite large, like around like over 8 ERR. But interestingly, no definite association among people exposed to adult. So this is a simple graphs. So Chernobyl accidents happened like 1986, and 4 years or 5 years later, the childhood thyroid cancer increased, and the female is more risky than males. Let's look at the health effect for cleanup workers. So there are some cancer risk for cleanup workers, especially leukemia show that increase of the risk, and also thyroid. But thyroid is there are some debating. So some researchers said that it's mainly due to screening effect, or some is not. So we have to still look it up and follow up. And also the solid cancer combined also instance is increases. For non-cancer disease, cataract was observed as low as 250 milligray, and also there are some trend of dose response. And also cardiovascular disease is also observed. But so far, there was no confounding factor adjust. So we're gonna look at, and we're gonna look at the other researchers for the cardiovascular disease adjusting for confounding factors. So this is the for resident. It's kind of a summary. So Chernobyl is the obvious thing is increase in childhood thyroid cancer, and no definitive conclusions about increase in any other cancer or disease. But cleanup workers, there are some cancer risk observed. For Fukushima, it is still not enough time to follow up, but it is not likely to be any increase in cancer based on current information. But we should follow up their health effect as a long-term follow-up. So now let's look at some studies of industry workers. So study for industrial workers, like radiation workers, is very important because they have accurate exposure assessment, and which enable us to make a direct assessment of risk at low dose radiation. So this is a typical distribution of radiation dose. So ABAM survivors is a very wide range, and the mean dose is around 0.1 gray. But the nuclear workers, their mean dose is far below than 0.1 gray. So we are going to look at the low-dose radiation effect using those kind of studies. And another one is air crews. Air crews also, some countries consider air crews is radiation workers, and because they exposed to cosmic radiation. So their exposure is relatively high compared to the radiation workers. So it's 2 to 5 millisievert per year. So end of their career is estimated about 70 millisievert. So this is a typical dose response curves. So as you can see, dose increases and health risk is mainly cancer risk increases, but a low dose range is say below than 100 millisievert. The risk association remain unclear. So now let's look at the actual data for several radiation worker study. This is the summary table for nationwide studies. So where actually I color green, but somehow it is not clear. So I color some values for easily understanding. So colors means statistical significance, and red color is kind of a negative effect, and green color is kind of a positive effect. So there are two measurements for cancer risk indication. One is a ERR, excessive relative risk. It's a cancer risk per radiation dose. And SMR is a standardized mortality rate, which is the comparison cancer risk to general population. So ERR consider radiation dose, and SMR doesn't take into radiation dose. So let's look at the SMR cases. SMR cases is a ratio between the radiation workers compared to the general population. So if the value is greater than 1, means that the health risk of radiation workers is greater than general population. So as you can see, the most studies show that the value is below than 1, which means that the health effect of radiation workers might be better than general population. But ERR cases, there is not consistent values, but some studies show that significant of cancer risk, even the cumulative mean dose is below than 100 millisievert. So this is, in works study, this is a large international cohort study, including the US and France and where is that? The UK. So recently they showed that there might be cancer risk in low dose ranges. So you are looking at that study in more details. So the Russia cases, their exposure dose is quite large. So it's of course there is some relationship between the radiation dose and cancer risk. But there are many studies, their results are not consistent and without not statistically significant. It's similar things. So this is a comparison for air crews and nuclear workers. So the circles, big circles is radiation workers in UK, and the other symbols is air crews. So the endpoint is SMR, standardized mortality rate. So like all cancer, leukemia, and melanoma, breast cancer. So they kind of not that much different, but melanoma cases, the air crews is somewhat higher than the radiation worker. And breast cancer, there is also not significant, but compared to the radiation workers, they might have a little bit higher than the radiation workers, but still there is no significant. So this measurement for SMR doesn't take into account, doesn't consider the radiation dose, just the cancer risk compared to general population. And now let's look at their cancer risk associated with the radiation dose. So they kind of, the Nordic study analyzed that the dose response for several cancer risk air crews. So as you can see, those response was not statistically significant. So we are not sure so far the air crews have increase of cancer risk as increase of radiation dose. So there are two summaries in there. One is health worker effect. There are two types of health worker effect. One is health worker higher effect, which is those who are not healthy are less likely to be employed. And the other one is healthy worker survival effect. And those who remain employed tend to be healthier than those who leave employment. So, which means that the health risk, the health status of radiation workers might be better than general population because of that kind of health worker effect. But this kind of effect is not limited to radiation workers. This is also common to other occupation types. And the other one is the risk of protracted exposure to low-dose radiation. This is in work study. So still, there is uncertainty in the low-dose ranges, but there is definitely indication of health risk, cancer risk increases in low-dose radiation because there are some trend over there. So now let's look at the lung cancer risk from plutonium. Well, so far we mainly look at the external exposure for usually the gamma ray, but this time we're gonna look at the kind of internal exposure from plutonium. This is kind of very important because that kind of study is very limited. So in this section, we have some understanding of health risk from exposure to inhaled plutonium. And also, we're going to look at the RBE for alpha particles. So as I said before, the health effect for internal exposure, especially plutonium, like alpha particles, is very limited. There are two representative cohort studies. One is a Maya worker cohort. The other one is Sellafield worker cohort study. And especially the Maya worker cohort study, it is very unique and fundamental information to give health effect associated with plutonium. Because their exposed dose is quite broad, and also their follow-up is pretty long. So two type of cohort study, their exposure consider both internal exposure due to plutonium and also external exposure in individual film fetch readings like gamma rays. So this is characteristics. So the study pooled two cohorts. So total number of workers is about 45,000 workers, and person years is about 1.5 million years. So it's relatively long. So let's look at the cumulative long dose. So the gamma exposure, like MWC stands for Maya worker, and SWC is for Sellafield workers. So Maya workers, their mean cumulative long dose is about 450 milligray, and Sellafield is smaller than Maya work. For plutonium exposure, it depending on solubility assumption, there are some like a wide range of cumulative long dose for internal exposure. But the Maya workers is around like 130 or 175, and Sellafield is like a 2 to 5 milligray. So now let's look at that lung cancer risk according to the external long dose and plutonium long dose. So external long dose, their relative risk, ERR, is around 0.2 to 0.4. It's quite comparable to other radiation worker study like ABAM survivors and other radiation worker study. But the plutonium long dose, the ERR is larger than the external doses because the plutonium is kind of an alpha particle exposure, so it might be the RBE effect. So summary for the plutonium exposure studies. So ERR for external gamma rays is 0.2 to 0.4, which is comparable to other studies. And internal exposure to alpha radiation is 5 to 8 relative risk per gray. So interestingly, there is a gender modification. The risk in female is greater than male. So considering ratio of ERR between external gamma exposure and alpha radiation, this ratio is about 10 to 25, which is the broad agreement with 20 of weighting factor for alpha particles. But still, there are large uncertainties over there. And also, there is a smoking effect. After adjusting for smoking, the ERR showed that decreases. And there is dose, and although there is uncertainty in low dose ranges, but still linear dose response across the entire dose ranges. So here is the discussion. Although the dose assessment for radiation field is quite accurate compared to other harmful agents, but still there is uncertainty, especially internal dose and organ dose estimation. So there are many the health physicists and biodosimetrists. We have to work together, and we have to improve those uncertainties. And the other one is health effect from low dose radiation is very difficult to assess effect due to the limited sample size and limited information of confounding factors. And also, we should consider non-cancer diseases because previously we mainly focused on cancer effect, but as the follow-up time increases, there are some non-cancer effects also observed. So especially cardiovascular disease and cataract, we also look at those kind of effects. And also, study of gene radiation interaction is necessary because it may provide us very useful information for susceptibility and sensibility of a radiation effect. So we have some time, so I'm going to introduce our study. So in Korea, we have two types of radiation workers depending on act. So Nuclear Safety Act, we call radiation worker, and medical character, we call diagnostic radiation workers. So our study population is radiation workers. So it consists of about like 9 occupation type, nuclear power plant, and non-destructive testing workers, which is industrial radiographer, something like that. So the total population is about 42,000 workers, and among them, nuclear power plant is a majority. And for annual dose of radiation workers, their radiation dose are quite well managed under the dose limit of 20 millisievert per year. But still, the NDT, industrial radiographers, is relatively higher than other occupation groups. Previously in Korea, a few epidemiology studies were conducted, but due to there is a large confidence interval. This is Korea, and this is other studies. So there are large confidence intervals, and sample size is quite smaller than other studies. And also, we focus on mainly like a cancer risk. So we still need to follow up, and we need to still collect more sample size. So, so that's why we launched the Korean radiation worker study in a prospective manner. So last year, we constructed a Korean radiation worker cohort. So the study aim is to construct a cohort of Korean radiation workers for long-term follow-up, and dose reconstruction for epidemiological study, and also investigate health risk of radiation workers exposed to protracted low-dose radiation. So here is a basic scheme for our study design. We conducted a nationwide survey for 42,000 radiation workers, and we collected baseline information, and also we received the individual radiation dose from the National Dose Registry. And then we are going to dose reconstruction, and we are going to link the health outcomes, and we're going to health risk assessment. In terms of health data, we are considering in this study, there are several types of data. Although the primary endpoint is cancer, but we are also looking at the data from National Health Insurance data, because that National Health Insurance data provide very useful information, such as the social economic status and non-cancer disease and some health checkup data. So we are going to use both to health data. So this is our cohort enrollment. So among about 42,000 workers, about 35,000 workers respond to the survey, but somehow there were missing of personal information and disagreement of study participation and incorrected personal information. The total number of cohort is about 20,608 workers. So for survey questionnaire, we have several type of categories in the questionnaire, like a work history and work practice and medical exposure, something like that. And here is the baseline characteristics. So majority is a male, and smoking status is a little bit higher in smoker group. And occupation is nuclear power plant is majority. And also the age of the first exposure dose is kind of less than 29 years old. So our cohort is pretty young, so we need a longer follow-up to ensure the definitive cancer risk or health risk from the low-dose radiation. So this is the distribution of a radiation dose. This is a typical radiation distribution. So the low-dose radiation, they are high proportion, and the higher exposure is a little bit in proportion. So our mean cumulative dose is about 12 millisievert, and radiation workers whose cumulative dose greater than equal to 100 millisievert is about 2%. So this is the cancer instance of our cohort. So there are total is 148 cancer instances were observed. So stomach is about 20% and colon is 8%. The majority cancer is thyroid cancer, which is 42%. So this is cancer instance by occupations. As you can see, there are not many differences among occupations. And now let's compare our trend of a cancer instance compared to general population. So this one is a blue color is a cancer instance according to the year of diagnosis in our study population. And this one is the general population from the Korean National Cancer Center. So as you can see, the cancer instance increases and goes up to like 2012 or 2013 and decreases in 2014. And similar pattern showed in our study cohort, like it hit the 2012 and decreased in 2014. This is the individual type of cancers in our study cohort. So let's look at the thyroid cancer, because thyroid cancer is majority. So thyroid cancer also increases up to like at 2012 and decreases. How about the thyroid cancer trend for general population? And also it's a similar patterns over there. So now we calculate the SIR, which is the age and sex specific standardized instance ratio, and also relative risk For relative risk, we use the internal comparisons. So those who exposed less than 0.1 millisievert for cumulative dose, we consider them as the internal comparison. So this is SIR, standardized incidence ratio. So as you can see, the SIR is below than 1, which means that the health status of radiation workers might be better than general population. So most cancers show that the SIR below than 1. But thyroid cancer is greater than 1, almost 2. So which means that thyroid cancer instance in radiation worker is higher than general population. So now we're gonna look at the thyroid cancer or solid cancer, how difference depending on radiation dose. So for the preliminary analysis, we just divide 2 groups. One is a control group, like people who exposed to less than 0.1 millisievert for cumulative dose is control group, and others kind of a exposed group. But as you can see, the relative risk is smaller than the exposed group, so which means that there might be dose dependence about cancer risk. And thyroid cancer is the same result as well, and all cancer except thyroid cancer shows the similar result. So the summary and future work of our study. So our study showed that the health worker effect, like a lower SIR compared to the general population, but high SIR for thyroid cancer. But those two kind of result is comparable, I mean similar to other previous worker studies. And we just analyzed for preliminary analysis for our data, but we are currently working on dose response analysis, and also we are going to link to the national health data for non-cancer disease. And our study have a few limitations. First of all, the limitation is a limited sample size, and also we didn't include the retired workers. So workers in our cohort is most active workers. So we are planning to enroll new workers and also retired workers. And also we are going to collaborate with other study groups, for example, like a Korean diagnostic radiation workers. And if possible, we are thinking about the international cohort studies. And also we continue the long-term follow-up. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you. If any questions or comment, please. Sure.
Very quick one.
Okay.
So in one slide, you showed that all cancer among the general population or among the workers, they increased all the way to 2012.
Right.
And then decreased. Do we have any explanation on that trend?
I guess the main contribution of the trend is thyroid cancer, because in Korea, thyroid cancer is a big issue recently. So the government kind of make a new guidelines of thyroid the screening test. So as far as I know, the guideline started like 2012 or 2013. So that's why the cancer incidence decreased at that point. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Then I'll toss my mic to.
So finally, it's lunchtime. I have been waiting for this very long. And so the lunch hour is actually about 1 hour. So we'll convene this workshop at 2 p.m. So the lunchbox will be delivered here soon.